So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Peter Watkins. Peter's been involved in teacher education for many years and is currently the course leader for the MA in Applied Linguistics and TESOL at the University of Portsmouth. His main research interests relate to teacher education and materials writing, and his publications include Teaching and Developing Reading Skills, Extensive Reading in ELT, and Extensive Reading for Primary in ELT. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Laura. And indeed, thank you to Cambridge University Press for inviting me here. I'm going to share my screen with you, so just bear with me while that happens. Okay, that's good. So hopefully now everyone can see the screen. Yes, thank you to Laura for the introduction. My name's Peter. I work here in the UK at the University of Portsmouth. What we're going to do today is talk about reading, and what I'm going to do is talk a bit about extensive reading, the research into extensive reading, and then how we can actually make extensive reading happen in our classrooms and for our learners. But before I do that, I just want to say a little bit about reading generally. And this is a quote from Nora Ephron. Some of you may well know Nora Ephron. She was a very famous screenwriter. She's probably most famous for writing When Harry Met Sally. She also directed Hollywood movies. And you can see that she says, reading is everything. Reading makes me feel I've accomplished something, learned something, become a better person. Reading makes me smarter. I think what comes across from Nora Ephron's quote there is that, the magic of reading, if you like, how incredible reading is. Reading really is an incredible human achievement. Through reading, we can, you can witness history as it was being made by reading eyewitness accounts. We can keep in touch with loved ones when we're thousands of miles apart by just sending and reading simple messages. And of course, when we can read, we can learn new stuff. We can, like Nora Ephron says, we can make ourselves smarter through reading. So reading really is an incredible thing, a magical thing. And yet I have to say that that's probably not the experience that all of my students have had when I've tried teaching them reading in the classroom, if I'm honest. It doesn't seem a magical experience anymore. And I think part of that is how we go about generally teaching reading in the classroom. So what I'm going to do is show you a sort of very brief lesson plan of a sort of typical reading lesson, if you like. And what I'd like you to do is just look at the plan and think for a few seconds about, is this something you recognize? Is this sort of how reading lessons that you teach, is this how they sort of look? Okay, so if we look at this, I think this is a fairly typical structure. Teachers start by building interest in the topic, and that's a really sensible, really good thing to do, because first of all, we want to motivate our learners into doing the reading. And also by building interest, we can supply some background knowledge about the topic. We can supply some background information. And we know from research that background information, background knowledge, helps comprehension. Typically, there's often a pre-teaching of vocabulary. So there are some difficult words in the text. Before the students read, we teach some of the difficult words. Generally, there's a quick reading task, maybe skimming or scanning, that is checked. And then a more detailed reading task, a sort of reading task that focuses on, well, uses things like multiple choice questions, true false questions, short answer things where the answer is explicitly stated in the text. And again, we check that. And then there may be a post-reading task, which is a discussion about the topic, or it may be a writing exercise related to the reading text, something like that. Now, I should say absolutely from the beginning that I'm not saying we should throw this out and never do it. I think there is some value to doing this. However, I think we could do more than this. I don't think reading should be totally dominated by only doing this. What this sort of lesson typically has is that the texts are quite short. Typically, they are at the very limit of learners' comprehensibility. So learners typically struggle to understand them. They're difficult. That's why we have to pre-teach the vocabulary, because they're really a bit too difficult for most learners, or a lot of the learners in the class. And then the other characteristic I really want to draw your attention to is in that second reading task, the sort of multiple choice type question thing, we really do quite a lot of testing of how much learners have managed to extract, what details have they managed to take from the text. Now, as I say, I'm not saying we should never do this, but I think there's more we could do. This is usually characterized as intensive reading, and one alternative to it is what is termed extensive reading, what we're going to be talking about today. So extensive reading is this. Some of you will probably know very well what extensive reading is, but let me just go over very quickly some of the principal characteristics. First of all, it's characterized by having relatively easy texts. Now, that means for most second language learners, that means using graded material, typically graded readers, but material that has been graded for vocabulary and also grammar, because we want the reading to be relatively easy for our learners. Because it's relatively easy, there is a focus on fluency, reading quite quickly. And if you put those two things together, it's quite easy, and people are reading quite quickly. It usually involves reading large quantities of text. So rather than reading quite short texts in a lot of detail, we're looking at reading quite long texts. Extensive reading is usually done individually and silently. And advocates of extensive reading, people who really sort of believe in extensive reading, believe that reading is pleasurable. Reading is its own reward, and that is something to which we will come back to in a little while. Extensive reading usually happens outside of class time and could take up to 20 to 30 minutes a day. It needs to be part of a program. So a learner who just reads once for 20 minutes probably won't get a lot of benefit. We need learners to really take part in a program of reading more or less every day. Now, if our learners are prepared to make that kind of investment, to spend 20 minutes or so a day reading, well, what would they get out of that? What benefits could they expect to find? So the benefits of extensive reading are these. And there's been a lot of research. I've only put one or two sources up for each thing, but actually there's a lot of research. And about an hour ago, just before I started talking, I was reading another research paper on extensive reading, which was a meta-analysis of quite recent research. And all of these findings are still true. You know, research is still showing them to be true. First of all, the amount of reading undertaken correlates with reading skills development. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, that's not surprising, right? We ask students to do more reading, their reading gets better. Yes, but the point I want to highlight here is it's not just their extensive reading that gets better. It's not just a learner's extensive reading. They also get better at that intensive type reading that I discussed at the beginning of the talk. You know, that detailed reading, the answering the true false questions type reading. They get better at that as well. Extensive reading leads to vocabulary growth. Yeah, this is well shown in many studies that learners learn vocabulary through having multiple exposures to words that they that they see when doing extensive reading. But it's not just a numbers game. It's not just about how many words. Learners also develop the quality of their vocabulary knowledge. So they start learning about collocations, how words are used together, which words they combine with. They learn about the style of words, so whether words are particularly formal or informal. So it's not just about the quantity of words, it's also about the quality. Extensive reading leads to writing skills development, and extensive reading leads to grammar acquisition. That also is really not surprising, because just about all models of grammar acquisition, grammar learning, put an emphasis on the need for input. Learners need to see a lot of examples of texts, and obviously extensive reading is one very, very good way of giving learners exposure to that language that they need in order to acquire grammar. And extensive reading, according to Day and Bamford, and I've included Day and Bamford as the source because it was a fairly seminal work on extensive reading. They say extensive reading may be more motivating than traditional classroom reading. That probably isn't too surprising, because where typical extensive reading works by giving learners a choice of material. In most programs, learners have a range of things they can read, and they select what they want to read. And whenever we give learners that sort of autonomy in choice, and choice in what they do, control over what they do, typically motivation for learning increases. So wherever it's possible, it's a good idea. So that may explain why extensive reading programs seem to motivate learners. It's to do with the choice they're given. Okay, so just to sum that up, this is a quote from Ellis and Shintani, two massively well-respected researchers. So there's plenty of evidence to support the claim that learning, especially of vocabulary, but not only of vocabulary, occurs through extensive reading. In other words, extensive reading supports language development. The research is overwhelming for that. It is absolutely overwhelming for that. And we should remember as well that reading doesn't just support language development. If we think back to that Nora Ephron quote I showed you at the very beginning, she said, "Reading makes me smarter." Reading makes me smarter, not just in terms of language development, but also learning about the world, learning about other cultures, learning about all kinds of stuff. And so extensive reading has that benefit as well. Also, people who read a lot tend to report less loneliness, which is actually a crucial indicator for mental well-being. So actually, reading has all kinds of benefits, as well as those linguistic ones I highlighted of better grammar, better vocabulary, better writing, better reading, of course. It has all those benefits, but others as well. Now, that said, I imagine that there's one very obvious, very simple question that you probably all would want to ask. And what I'm going to do, you could maybe put that into the chat box, what you think the question is, just while I have a sip of water, and then we will carry on. I think the very obvious question to ask, given all the evidence, given the evidence of how extensive reading works, is the one posed at the top there by Renanda and Jacobs back in 2002. Why aren't we all doing it? Why isn't extensive reading part of just about every language learning program? Why aren't we getting learners to do it all the time? McAllister did a little bit of research into this, and he interviewed teachers, and the teachers expressed positive beliefs about the benefits of extensive reading, that they believed extensive reading would lead to language development. However, they also said, but we don't do it. So the teachers were saying, we understand what extensive reading is, we believe it works, but we don't do it. So okay, we need to ask ourselves why not. Okay, and this is really the main part of the talk, if you like, is what can we do to actually make learners do it? So what are the barriers? Okay, well, in some cultures, in some teaching and learning contexts, it may be that there's a suspicion of learner autonomy. So that's sort of giving learners choice and what I described just now about motivation. There may be a bit of a suspicion in that and a preference for teacher-fronted classes, fairly traditional didactic style classes with the teacher at the front. But actually, remember, extensive reading doesn't challenge that. Because we said extensive reading typically happens outside the classroom. So it doesn't really challenge that culture if that exists. In some teaching and learning contexts, there is a curriculum that maybe prioritizes the explicit knowledge of grammar and vocabulary. I'm sure this is true. A lot of the teachers I work with tell me this. But again, we should remember extensive reading actually supports the development of grammar and vocabulary knowledge. It doesn't work against this, it supports this. Another claim often put forward for why extensive reading doesn't happen more is that it doesn't, it has a very low profile, or in some cases a non-existent profile in teacher education programs. That may be true. It may be true, but it certainly isn't what McAllister found. You know, the teachers McAllister interview said they were well aware of what extensive reading was. So that may vary with teaching context, where we are in the world and so on. Now, there are other reasons why I think, other barriers to why extensive reading doesn't happen more. It can be difficult to assess. There's a difficulty of ensuring learners have text through at the right level, a lack of time, a lack of appropriate resources, and a sense that reading is not pleasurable. Okay, so those are some of the barriers, and those ones at the bottom there, the difficulty of assessment down, are what we're going to talk about now. So how can we make extensive reading happen? What can we do to try to make extensive reading happen? Because if we believe it works, and the research tells us it does, we want our learners to engage in this if at all possible. Okay, so the first thing, we need to provide a range of appropriate material and use it with the learners. Now, clearly there has to be the material in the first place. We can't ask students to read if there's nothing to read. But a lot of teachers tell me that their schools, their institutions do have some reading material. It's in a library somewhere, it's in a learning resources center, the books are on a shelf, the books have a lot of dust on them, nobody uses them. And so if the learners won't go to the books, we need to take the books to the learners, I think. And how can you do that? Well, take a couple of books to a lesson and just read the first page or the first couple of paragraphs to them and ask them what they think of the book, how they think it will develop, what will happen next. Try to engage the learner's interest in it. You could do the same kind of thing by showing the learners the covers of a couple of books, and from the covers, seeing if the learners can predict the genre of the book and what the sort of style of book it will be. And in schools where there's a broader curriculum, so the students are learning maths and geography and history and literature and different things, it may be possible to integrate reading into the broader curriculum a little bit. So if the learners are doing a science project, for example, it may be possible for them to read about some aspect of science or famous scientists or something like that. So we need to make sure there's a range of material, but then we need to really try to do all we can to get learners to engage with that material. Okay, we want to make extensive reading easy. This is absolutely fundamental. We want extensive reading to be easy. Now, graded readers, for example, will normally come with some kind of level attached to them, usually stated in terms of the Common European Framework of Reference. So it will be A1, A2, B1, that sort of thing. But of course, not all our learners in one class are at exactly the same level. And so we need to make sure learners are choosing for themselves, particularly as learners are going to be perhaps choosing books for themselves. We want them to choose something appropriate. And I teach my students a very simple readability, what I call a readability test. All they do is open the book to more or less any page in the book, and they count 100 words. They just count 100 words and then ask themselves, how many of these words do I not know? How many do I not know? And if the students don't know more than 4 or 5 of the words out of 100, it's probably too difficult for them. And they could choose something a bit easier. Estimates vary, but generally speaking, the research suggests learners need to know between 95 and 98% of the words on the page. So what I like about this little readability test is it's entirely private. The students don't tell anyone they've done it. They don't tell anybody the result of it. They just choose a different book because the first one they picked up actually looks a bit difficult for them. And what I want to try to do is get the learners to feel no anxiety about this. That's really what we're trying to do. This links back to the first point, involve learners. So we want to give learners plenty of choice. That's choice in what they read, but also to have some sort of ownership of the reading program itself. And that might be achieved through, for example, commenting on the material. There may be a list of books that it's possible for them to borrow at roughly at their level, and they can comment on them. They could even give them a star rating, 5 stars if they think it's great, down to 1 star if they think it's absolute shocking and they don't want to read anything like that ever again. That's fine. Give learners a chance to express their views, give them some investment in the program itself. Okay. Yeah, we want to make reading fun. I've said this before, is it pleasurable? And I want to say a bit more about that in just a moment. But we do want to reduce anxiety. If we think back to that model of intensive reading that I showed you just at the very start, and I talked about the multiple choice questions and the true false questions. Essentially, those things are tests. We test learners' understanding a lot. And any test can be quite anxiety provoking for learners. So we could just use a process assessment. And by process assessment, I just mean all we have to do is assess and check that the learners are engaging in the program, that they're actually doing some reading. And as long as they are doing some reading, we will just trust the research because the research is so strong. We will just trust the research. So how could we go about process assessment? Well, it may just be keeping a log. The learners might just write down a few words about what they read each day, for example. I think it's really important that teachers act as role models for their students. So role models of being a reader in a second language. Well, probably being a role model as a reader, full stop, but certainly in a second language. So that might be telling your learners what you're doing, what you're reading at the moment, what you were reading at their age, what you liked reading, what benefits you've gained from reading, those sorts of things, but try to show that you yourself as a teacher are also a reader, because teachers are really influential in kids' lives. And value reading, and put time aside to discuss it. Now, I know what most of you are probably thinking. There isn't time for this, right? Time is our great enemy. Time is the enemy of all teachers. Our managers, our ministries of education tend to like to cram into syllabuses as much as they can possibly get into syllabuses. And teachers then feel the pressure of, oh, I've got to do this by the end of term, and I've got to do this, and I've got to do this. So when I say put time aside to discuss it, it doesn't have to be a whole lesson. It could be 4 or 5 minutes, okay, at the start of a lesson. As students walk into your class, you could talk about what they're reading, or whether they would like to go to the Learning Resources Centre and choose a book and these sorts of things. But try and put some time aside, 5 minutes at the beginning of a lesson, 5 minutes at the end of a lesson, maybe when you're thinking, oh, the lesson's sort of finished and I need to fill up the time. Try to talk about reading a bit and show a value to reading. Particularly at primary levels, reading to students is a really good way of helping them read. And I want to just tell you a little bit about, I think I've got time, I'll just do this very quickly. Read to students. Joanna Westbrook and her colleagues did some research. Now, this was done in English secondary schools. So it was done in an L1 first language sort of context. The kids were 12 to 13 years old. They were identified through reading tests, standard comprehension type tests, as being average to weak readers. And what the teachers did was they decided they would teach reading through reading to the students quite quickly. They read 2 novels, unabridged, 2 full novels in 12 weeks, just reading quite quickly to the students in lessons, and the students followed. And this replaced the sort of traditional reading lessons that they were having, which in the UK is a lot of detail about what does this word mean and what does that word mean and that sort of thing. So the intervention lasted 12 weeks. On average, the students made the equivalent progress of 5 to 8 months. So in about 3 months, they made between 5 and 8 months progress. However, the very weakest readers, made up to 16 months progress in 3 months, just by having a teacher read quite quickly, quite fluently, and have the students follow. So if you get the chance, read to students. Okay, now we said that extensive reading generally happened outside of the classroom. So I think that means we need to build a partnership with homes. So how to do that? Well, you could, for example, prepare an information sheet for learners to take home so their parents, their caregivers, understand the expectations, what you want the kids to do, how they can be helped. They can be helped simply by being encouraged to do it, actually just doing it. And if the parents don't speak any English, that's absolutely fine. They can still talk to the kids about what they've read, what the story's about. And obviously the information sheet itself absolutely does not have to be in English. It could be in whatever language is appropriate. Now, you can see the talk was called, I think, 8 ways to make extensive reading happen, and there are 8 there. However, that is a peril. That is a danger of giving the title of the talk before actually writing the detail of the talk, because there is a 9th. I promise this is the final one, but there is a 9th one, and that is use instrumental motivation. So we said at the beginning that advocates, people who believe in extensive reading, often say reading is its own reward. Reading is its own, people just enjoy reading. Now, let me tell you a secret. I am currently trying to learn Spanish. My Spanish isn't all that great. And I have to say, I do try to read in Spanish because I know it will be good for me. But I have to say, it's not all that pleasurable. It really isn't. For me, Netflix and a bottle of wine, that's pleasurable. Reading in a second language, which is still a bit difficult, short stories that are really simplified and 2-dimensional characters, it's not great pleasure. So I think we need to redefine pleasure. When we say it will be its own reward, students will read for pleasure, no. But they will read with an absence of pain. So pleasure is really here about it's not painful, it's not anxiety provoking, it's not difficult. On the subject of instrumental motivation, we can give rewards, particularly for young learners. So as they do a piece of reading, we give them points, not individually necessarily, but to the class. And when the class get enough points for doing enough reading, we give them a treat. The treat might be, I don't know, I have no idea what the reward will be. You could take them a cake. You could take them a cake, for example, or they could watch a video of something they like, or they could sing a song in English. Whatever you think a reward for them would be, give them a reward. And also, make sure learners understand the benefits of extensive reading. So what I do with my learners is I give them a discussion task like this. There's a Likert scale to this, but I couldn't get it on the PowerPoint slides. You know, the sort of thing like very strongly agree, agree, disagree, and so on. And the students do it individually, then they talk in groups, then they report back. And of course, what that is just an excuse to tell them, look, if you read, you'll get better at writing. Your grammar will get better. Your reading will get better. Your grammar will get better. It's just a way of showing them the benefits so they actually want to do the reading, because it may not absolutely be pleasure, but extensive reading isn't painful because it's not difficult. It's not anxiety provoking. Okay, that's more or less all I want to say. I think I may have gone a minute or so over. Above all, experiment with reading, make it relatively easy, fun, anxiety-free, wherever possible. And remember, by doing that easy reading, along with some of the other intensive reading, learners will get better. They will get better at that intensive reading by doing the extensive reading. There are a few things to read. This is in the Cambridge papers in ELT series, extensive reading in English language teaching, why and how. That's more or less what we've talked about today. I wrote an accompanying one to that, extensive reading for primary in ELT. That includes readers' theatre and dialogic reading and stuff like that. They're both absolutely free. You can download them from the website. There is also a book, and there is a chapter in the book on extensive reading, but I'm afraid the book is not free, but the other two are. Those are the references that I've mentioned today as I've been talking. That is where you can get your certificate. That link should give you the chance to get your certificate. And I am going to stop talking. So thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. That was so interesting, and there's been lots of really interesting conversations in the chat as well. So thanks to everyone who's been contributing ideas. So we've got some good questions through. If you've got any more, feel free to post them in the Q&A box. We've got just over 10 minutes to do Q&A. So one question, is reading through iPads or any other devices, does it give the same valuable results as reading with print books?
That's a really, really fantastic question. As far as I'm aware, yes, but I'm not sure that any extensive reading research explicitly into extensive reading has made that variable between, is there a difference between the print and the screen? But there is some really interesting research about print and screen reading. And in fact, it's going off in a slightly different direction, so I'll be very quick. But that research suggests that we actually understand less from a screen when it's a factual information-based text. So if we read factual information-based text, we tend to understand less from a screen than we do from paper. But I'm not sure about the research. I can't think why it wouldn't work. Let's put it that way. It's research that needs doing, whether the reading from a screen will work for extensive reading, but I can't think why it wouldn't.
Great. Lots of questions about reading in a second language. You touched briefly on readers. Have you got any other suggestions that you could give for
anything? Yeah, anything that is easy for learners, and probably if you just Google, to be honest, sort of low-level reading text in English, obviously if you're teaching English, but actually, you know, the research into reading goes across languages. So, you know, even if you're teaching Spanish or French or German as a second language, it should still work in theory. Anything that you'll find, there are quite a few free resources that you can find. Some of them are country specific. And, you know, whatever your learners are interested in, really the message is probably all reading is good reading. So whatever you can get your learners interested in and wanting to read, that would be great.
Brilliant. And then some people asking for your references. Would you mind just going back a slide and Share.
Let's hope I can.
If it's possible. There we go. So that's up on the screen.
So that was the first page of references.
I think it was Watkins that someone was asking
Oh,
about.
of course. Okay.
Yeah, just to say there are links in the chat going up for Peter's book and the free downloads. Someone's asked about audiobooks. Do you think that would help non-readers?
Yeah, thank you. I have to say, when I was sort of when we were watching that little introduction video, I was seeing how people all over the world sort of saying hello to each other. It was awe-inspiring, wonderful. And that is another great question. I wish I'd had the sense to mention it while I was speaking. Audiobooks do help. Yes, audiobooks are great. That idea that students read and listen at the same time. What audiobooks tend to do is push the reader to read at a particular speed, which may be a little bit quicker than they would naturally do for themselves, but and that helps. The research shows that helps to develop reading fluency. And when students can read fluently, when they can read quite quickly, the accuracy also goes up. So it's a really good way. So thank you to whoever asked that question about audiobooks, because I should have said it. So you've saved me. It's a really good idea. And it does relate to that thing I said about teachers reading to students as well, because teachers, if they're doing it in a classroom situation, of course, teachers can actually read to their students, which is another great thing to do.
So another question we've got, so I suppose it relates back to the idea of levels. Should students be reading a book at their CEFR level or a level higher?
No, they shouldn't be well, there's a slight tension here, because first of all, we want to give students as much autonomy as they can. So the students, we want to choose what they feel comfortable with doing and what they want to do. But my advice would go back to that readability test that I mentioned. Get the students to read 100 words, count how many they don't know, because ideally for extensive reading, we want them to be able to understand 95 to 98% of the words on the page. So, they may be a little bit between CEFR levels, to be honest, the students. So what we want them to do is they can do that more personalized sort of test to see whether the book is going to be appropriate for them. So we want the students to choose something, obviously, that they're interested in, but also is relatively easy for them to read.
Brilliant. Some people asking about assessment. Some people saying they have to assess their students after each graded reader. How can we do this? How can we ease their anxiety around testing and assessment?
Oh, that's a really difficult question, because obviously once we say we have to test our students, that is almost bound to bring some anxiety to it. I think, however, we need to sort of just try to focus the students on whatever feedback they get from the test. Even if they don't do very well in the test, we say that's fine, that's just another piece of feedback. Just choose a slightly easier book, just keep choosing something until you start getting it right. Don't worry too much about saying, oh, well, I've got 4 questions wrong in this, and therefore I'm a bad reader and I'm a bad person and I'm terrible. No, just focus on, look, the research tells us you're going to get better if you do it. Just read something easy. So try to get students to see the process, that even if the test itself doesn't go well, as long as they keep involved in the process, they will get better. And just try to explain that to them. But I know once we start testing students, it is very difficult to tell them it doesn't matter, sort of thing, because obviously to them it does matter.
Absolutely. Obviously, a lot of teachers are still teaching online. Have you got any recommendations for encouraging reading while you're teaching online?
Well, actually, reading online, while we're all teaching online, it's probably a way of sharing things. I think also just setting up groups so that students can talk to each other online about what they're reading, making sure that maybe they get a chance to report back on what they've read. There could be shared documents that they type into and so on, so that others can read their reviews, their comments. So It is difficult, of course. It's difficult for everybody at times, I think, to maintain their motivation at the moment when, maybe they're not going to school, or they're everything's done online. But really, it's just a question of saying, well, share, talk to each other. Yeah, that's really all I can think of, I think.
And then some questions about different genres of text, whether articles and scientific magazines and things like that count for
Yeah,
extension.
that's absolutely another fantastic question. Thank you for that question. Yes, we should remember we want learners to pick things that they themselves are sort of interested in. And some people probably prefer reading fiction. Some people like reading factual text. They like reading biographies or informational texts. Both are perfectly fine. Both are perfectly fine. Research suggests that factual texts are probably a little bit harder to read, a little bit harder to understand. That we don't know exactly why, but it's probably to do with the density of the information. Factual texts tend to have information slightly more densely packed than narrative fictional works. But both are perfectly fine. Whatever, again, it really comes back to all reading is good reading. So whatever your learners are going to be interested in, that would be great. And if you can match it to other bits of the curriculum and integrate it to other bits of the curriculum, and that probably would be more factual and informational, that may be quite motivating for learners as well, because they're sort of getting two for the price of one. They're learning about one subject while also learning about English.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a few questions around young learners and particularly preschool, from how would one aid preschool levels from phonics to reading common words that don't follow phonic sounds?
Okay, yeah, really, really good question, because another really good question, because what I should probably have pointed out is that, beginner readers and preschool, very young learners, they must, the evidence, the research evidence is very clear. Phonics works. Phonics is absolutely crucial to that. And this doesn't replace phonics. So this is a question of trying then to move from sort of that code of, letter sound correspondences to maybe sight words. Now, English isn't all that transparent. You can look at some English words and it would be hard to sort of decode them using a pure phonics system. So you need to go to sort of whole word recognition type technique. So if you take a word like, I don't know, a very common word like because, for example, if you tried to start spelling that out, as it were, and go be, ek, a, us, et, you're not going to get anything close to because probably in your head. So you need to teach that as a sort of whole word recognition, and just keep repeating them. And the research evidence is the quicker the students can recognize them, this really has big advantages for their reading. Reading requires lots of things to happen simultaneously, really, really quickly. So getting learners just to recognize common words very, very quickly and automatically is really good practice. I sometimes, when I used to teach younger kids, games like Snap, I don't know if people know Snap, where you turn over a card and is it the same word, and you have words that look a bit similar, but they've actually got to decode the word. Anything that sort of makes them do it quickly is good practice. And do it with known words, of course. Explain what the word is before you try and get students to read a word. Essentially, they can't read a word they don't know.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, that's all we've got time for today. So thank you so much, Peter. And thanks to
Thank you.
everyone who's contributed so much to the session.